Côte d'Ivoire didn't just vote, they declared war on a sovereign Africa. On May 29, 2025, at the headquarters of the African Development Bank in Abidjan, a vote was cast. But behind that ballot, behind that calm facade of diplomacy, something darker unfolded. Senegal's candidate, Amadou Hott, was expected to rise, endorsed by ECOWAS, respected across Africa. But he was stopped. Not by merit, not by policy, but by a silent betrayal from within. This wasn't a technical decision. It was a political ambush. A foreign-backed government aligned with France decided that Africa must not govern its own bank. And so they acted. Behind closed doors. With precision. The African dream was wounded not by outsiders, but by our own. If you believe this matters, pause here. Like, comment, and subscribe. Because this story is not about one election. It's about the soul of Africa. And someone just tried to sell it. On May 29, 2025, a new president was elected to lead the African Development Bank. Senegal's candidate, an experienced economist and former vice president of the same bank, was endorsed by ECOWAS. But on the voting floor, that support disappeared. Côte d'Ivoire, the host nation, quietly backed an outsider from outside the bloc. Nigeria stood silent. Benin withheld its vote. And what seemed like a united front shattered. This was not diplomacy. This was denial of sovereignty, of dignity, of African self-determination. And for those who still believe ECOWAS speaks with one voice, this was the moment they woke up. Because the betrayal didn't come from the West. It came from the table itself. They smiled in front of the cameras. They shook hands. They spoke of unity. But behind the marble walls of the African Development Bank, knives were drawn. In the days leading up to the vote, everything looked aligned. ECOWAS had issued a formal communiqué endorsing the Senegalese candidate, an economist of towering reputation. Respected across the continent. Heads of state released statements. Media ran headlines of, West Africa rallies behind one of its own. It was meant to be a coronation. But coronations only work when the kingdom is real. Inside the corridors of Abidjan, a very different meeting was taking place. Côte d'Ivoire, officially the neutral host of the AFDB, had already made its move. Quietly. Methodically. It had reached out to the delegations of countries more interested in stability than sovereignty. Countries still shackled to the old franc zone. Countries where diplomatic alignment is not about principle but about permission. And so the betrayal began. Benin, which had once proposed a candidate of its own, withdrew, and gave no support to Senegal. Nigeria, the sleeping giant, decided to stay on the fence. Silence, in diplomacy, is never neutral. It's consent by other means. Others followed. Votes that had been promised quietly disappeared. Rooms that had once echoed with support turned silent. And in that silence, Côte d'Ivoire moved. They whispered of technocratic merit, of Pan-African balance. But everyone knew what was really at play: fear. Fear of a Senegal that speaks too loudly. That demands too directly. That refuses to ask Paris for permission. Because make no mistake, this wasn't about one man. This was about one model. Senegal, under Traoré and Sonko, represents a sovereignist tide that scares the comfortable. It speaks of non-alignment, South-South diplomacy, reform from within. It dares to imagine African finance built by Africans. For Africans. And in boardrooms still haunted by French accents, that is dangerous. Côte d'Ivoire. It stands for the opposite. Institutional continuity. Stability over courage. Loyalty over autonomy. And so, it chose not to compete, but to sabotage. No press conference was held. No hands were raised. The betrayal needed no announcement. It played out in real time. Inside the private chambers of the vote. And when the results were read, there was no surprise. Only shame. Senegal stood alone. Its candidate, once a frontrunner, was out. And the whispers began, not about the winner, but about the way the game had been played. This wasn't a loss. It was a setup. A regional institution meant to amplify African unity had been weaponized to preserve the very divisions it was built to erase. And for those watching carefully, one thing became clear: ECOWAS is not broken by external pressure. It's corroded from within. At its core lies a contradiction. How can a bloc claim integration when its members sabotage each other? How can it promote economic vision when it cannot protect its own candidate? How can it speak of sovereignty when it still answers to colonial logic? Côte d'Ivoire may have won the battle, but it exposed the war. A war between two Africas, one dreaming forward, the other clinging backward. And in that moment, something broke. Not just a candidacy, but a covenant. A belief that African unity is real, not just rhetorical. That the phrase, African solutions to African problems, means more than PR. Across Dakar, students marched in protest. Not because they had lost, but because they had seen the system unmasked. Newspapers across the Sahel ran bold headlines: ECOWAS betrays sovereignty. Even quiet voices in Ghana and Togo questioned the cost of silence. In private briefings, Traoré's advisors called the move expected, but disappointing. One even said, "We just learned who still answers to Paris." But Dakar did not burn bridges. Days later, Sonko walked into Abidjan. Not in fury, but in clarity. He met with Ouattara. He met with Gbagbo. He didn't plead. He listened. He reminded them, Africa's future doesn't belong to one bloc or one ideology. It belongs to the people. That's when the real story began to shift. Because this wasn't a defeat. It was a declaration. Senegal had shown its hand. And it was clean. Côte d'Ivoire had shown its power. And it was borrowed. This is the point where we pause and ask. If you believe that Africa deserves leadership that serves its people, not its patrons, leave a comment. Let your voice be louder than the silence that betrayed this vote. This isn't just history. It's a mirror. And it's asking all of us. Which Africa do you serve? There is a saying among American diplomats: if you want to find the power in the room, watch who speaks last. But in West Africa today, real power doesn't always speak. It whispers. It lingers in protocols. It hides behind the language of neutrality. And in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire has mastered the whisper. The country positions itself as a beacon of continuity, stable, investor-friendly, globally respected. It's the Africa that the West wants: predictable, polished, and permanently cooperative. But this polished exterior conceals a fragile foundation, dependency masked as diplomacy. Alassane Ouattara is not just the president of Côte d'Ivoire. He's a former IMF official. A product of the Bretton Woods system. Fluent in the codes of Washington and Paris. And in this moment, he didn't need to say a word. His networks did the work. Behind closed doors, the narrative was simple: Senegal is radical. Sonko and Diome are unpredictable. Do you really want to hand Africa's premier development bank to that? And so the quiet campaign began, not to win, but to erode. Not to promote an alternative, but to make sovereignty seem like a threat. This wasn't diplomacy. It was damage control for an empire in retreat. The irony. No Western ambassador had to show up. African leaders did it for them. This is the hidden cost of neocolonialism, when the agents of dependency no longer need external handlers. The playbook has been internalized. ECOWAS, once hailed as the engine of integration, has become a mechanism for containment. Not of conflict, but of imagination. Where are the bold ideas? The continental infrastructure? The Pan-African energy grid? The single currency? Buried beneath meetings. Choked by alignment with external partners. Dissolved in fear of rupture. Because rupture, to this order, is risk. And risk is bad for markets. Côte d'Ivoire doesn't fear a failed state. It fears a free one. That is why a sovereign Senegal is more dangerous than instability. Because it sets precedent. It asks others, what if we said no, too? In this framework, even silence is strategic. Nigeria's neutrality. It wasn't apathy. It was calculation. Abuja is watching. Waiting. weighing options in a shifting regional game. The elephant has no friends, it only watches the grass bend. And Benin. It wanted to avoid the spotlight. To stay useful to both camps. This, too, is power. The power of hedging. Of ambiguity as armor. But it's the Ivorian stance that broke the dam. By backing a non-ECOWAS candidate, Côte d'Ivoire not only shattered a political alliance, it reasserted a psychological truth. That the post-colonial elite will always choose order over freedom. Even if that order is unjust. Even if that freedom is earned. And so, we return to the AFDB. What is a bank, if not a mirror of ideology? It lends, but it also defines. It builds roads, but also worldviews. And who controls its leadership controls more than loans. They shape how development is imagined, prioritized, distributed. Imagine a Sonko-aligned leadership. Projects that favor regional value chains. Investments in food sovereignty. Public finance with fewer European consultants and more African economists. Imagine the ripple. Now imagine how threatening that is to those who've built entire careers around partnerships that never quite deliver power. That is why the Senegalese bid had to be stopped. Not for incompetence. But for the competence it represented. Because if sovereignty can be competent, then the entire argument for dependency collapses. This is the true war, not between countries, but between philosophies. Do we accept a future of managed autonomy, where African ambition is always translated through Paris, Brussels, or Washington? Or do we dare to govern ourselves, in our own image, at our own pace, with our own frameworks? The AFDB election was supposed to be boring. But it ended up becoming the most honest referendum on African sovereignty in a decade. Not because of who won, but because of how they won. And who lost us. Traoré's Burkina Faso issued no angry statement. But inside their press briefings, there was clarity: this is why we withdrew. This is why sovereignty cannot be voted on in rooms we don't control. Mali's interim government released one line: some doors lead to mirrors. Some to cages. Know which you're opening. Even Niger, silent for months, held a closed-door roundtable with Senegalese envoys just 3 days after the result. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. Because what happened in Abidjan didn't just weaken ECOWAS. It strengthened something else. A new idea. One no longer content with regionalism trapped in colonial scaffolding. A financial coalition, not of donors, but of builders. Not of fragile summits. But of shared steel. They're not announcing it. Not yet. But it's moving. And here's the irony: the more ECOWAS silences dissent, the louder the idea becomes. Every time sovereignty is betrayed in the open, a new blueprint is whispered underground. And it always begins with one question. If not this system, then what? The people of Africa are beginning to answer. In the wake of Abidjan, something shifted, not just in policy rooms, but in the marrow of West African politics. The betrayal of Senegal didn't echo like a thunderclap. It pulsed, low and steady, like the beat of war drums in the distance. It was Mali that moved first, not publicly, but intentionally. A closed-door session in Bamako brought together senior economic advisors from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The topic wasn't just the AFDB fiasco. It was what would come next. Because when a system shows its cards, you either fold or build a new table. They chose the latter. Within days, informal signals began circulating through alternative diplomatic channels. Not embassies, but engineer corps. Not think tanks, but logistics officers. What they discussed wasn't just theoretical. It had a name. A new financial coordination unit, temporary. Flexible, sovereign, meant to pool resources, synchronize budget planning, and fund continental priorities from within. No World Bank consultants. No CFA franc middlemen. No Brussels approvals. Just Africans. Building. It was called, quietly, the Iron Fund. And it wasn't designed to rival ECOWAS. It was designed to survive it. Because ECOWAS, as it stands today, no longer speaks for the Sahel. It speaks for banks. For presidents in waiting. For the old compact between obedience and aid. But the Sahel has no more patience for obedience. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, when briefed on the failed vote, reportedly said only this: "If they won't let us in, they're just confirming what we've known, we were never meant to belong." Côte, in a rare direct statement, added, "Our sovereignty is not a campaign. It's our breath." Even Tiani, whose government had remained silent for weeks, authorized a massive restructuring of Niger's National Development Fund. The decree was issued in French, but the intention was clear: independence by financing, not just rhetoric. The message from the AES alliance was not shouted. It was built. In cement. In solar panels. In irrigation channels. The betrayal in Abidjan didn't break them. It vindicated them. For months, the world had asked, where is the alternative? What will these revolutionary leaders do when cut off from international systems? Now we have the answer. They will build their own. The Iron Fund began with modest numbers: joint procurement for fertilizer, pooling technical teams for dam audits, merging medical supply logistics. But what mattered wasn't scale. It was the shift in mindset. From aid to agency. From compliance to creativity. And slowly, across the Sahel, the effect began to ripple. Local banks started adapting procurement forms based on the new templates. University departments in Ouagadougou and Bamako launched research initiatives titled Fiscal Sovereignty in Post-ECOWAS Economies. Even diaspora groups, long skeptical, started channeling remittances into community-run development cooperatives that didn't pass through state channels, but were aligned with Iron Fund principles. This wasn't theory. It was a rupture. One that made the post-Abidjan silence in Abuja deafening. Nigeria, always balancing between continental ambition and internal crisis, suddenly found itself staring at two visions of the future, and neither were under its control. Inside ECOWAS headquarters, the language became defensive. Memos were leaked. One internal document reportedly read, "If we lose Senegal and AES, we become a market bloc with no moral authority." That line wasn't meant for public ears. But it rang like gospel across digital Sahel. Because what is regionalism without moral clarity? What is a bloc, if its strongest voices are punished for dreaming beyond their borders? What happened in the AFDB election was more than a vote. It was a mirror. And ECOWAS didn't like what it saw. Meanwhile, Senegal didn't retreat. It recalibrated. Prime Minister Sonko launched a regional listening tour. Not to campaign, but to listen. From the fisheries of Casamance to the cotton fields of Kays. He asked the same question: if we could build one institution, one only, what would it be? The answer surprised even his advisors. It wasn't a new parliament. Not even a court. It was a sovereign lending bank. One that didn't ask Paris. Didn't need Washington. One that started from the soil, not the spreadsheet. And so, the blueprint spread. This was never just about power. It was about permission. For decades, African nations were taught that permission came from outside. That development was something to be allowed, not authored. The AFDB betrayal made one thing clear. If sovereignty must be bought, then it will always be borrowed. But now, it will be built. With new rules. New alliances. And most dangerously, new faith. The faith that Africa is not too fragile to govern itself. That West Africa can lead, not with charity, but with conviction. That when ECOWAS fractures, something stronger can rise through the cracks. This is not optimism. It is architecture. You don't have to believe it will work. You just have to accept, it has already begun. Because the silence from the AFDB is deafening. The silence from ECOWAS is defensive. But the silence from the Sahel, it's strategic. It's sovereign. And it's building. What if ECOWAS was never ours to begin with? That's the twist no one wanted to face. That the failure in Abidjan wasn't an accident. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. Because behind every diplomatic bloc, every bank presidency, every carefully worded communiqué, there is a ledger. A budget. And in that ledger are names that don't speak Mandinka, Wolof, or Hausa. They speak French. They speak IMF. They speak EU Development Fund. Pull the threads, and you find them all. Annual ECOWAS budget. 70% donor-funded. AFDB operational frameworks. Aligned with EU's partnership priorities. Strategic goals. Private sector-led growth, migration control. Security partnerships, all phrases cut and pasted from Brussels and Washington templates. This isn't conspiracy. It's accounting. He who pays, commands. So when Côte d'Ivoire moved, when Nigeria stayed silent, when Benin backed away, it wasn't just geopolitical strategy. It was obedience coded into funding formulas. The idea of ECOWAS as a family of equals was beautiful. But it was also fiction. The real question is, when did it become more loyal to donor confidence than citizen sovereignty? Every time a sovereignist leader rises, Sankara, Gaddafi. Now Traoré, Sonko, they're not attacked for incompetence. They're attacked for being unmanageable. Uncontrollable. Unauthorized. Because that's the key word, authorization. Africa was never asked to be sovereign. It was authorized to simulate it. Build your roads, but let us audit them. Hold your elections, but let us fund the monitors. Train your soldiers, but let us choose the uniforms. That's the cost of the deal. A sovereign show. A managed performance. A pageant of independence, underwritten by oversight. And ECOWAS. It became the best stage for that performance. Until someone forgot their lines. Senegal, under Diomé and Sonko, said the quiet part out loud. Traoré, Goïta, Tiani stopped performing. And that's when the mask slipped. Abidjan wasn't just an election. It was a revelation. That sovereignty, to this system, is a threat. That independence, to this order, is insubordination. That African unity is welcomed, as long as it's approved. So we ask again. Was ECOWAS ever about us? Or was it a borderless cage, gilded with the language of integration, while policed by the logic of dependency? This is not about bitterness. It's about truth. And the truth is, the betrayal in Abidjan was not the beginning. It was the end of the illusion. Because now, the veil has dropped. The actors have left the stage. And the people, finally, see the strings. Not every block is built for freedom. Some are built to delay it. They told us the system was broken. Now we know, it was rigged. ECOWAS didn't fail because of one election. It failed because it forgot who it was supposed to serve. And when sovereignty knocked, it locked the doors from the inside. But that door is open now. Not because they invited us in. But because we stopped asking. Across the Sahel, a new code is being written, in action, not application. In steel, not signatures. In sweat, not sanction. This is not the end of regionalism. It's its rebirth. On our terms. In our voice. So if this story moved you, if it echoed something buried in your chest, then do one thing. Like this video. Comment what you believe sovereignty truly means. Subscribe to join a generation that no longer begs for approval. Because the mask is off. The illusion is dead. And the next chapter is ours to write.